Good evening, I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Tonight on the show, we're going to be focusing on Singapore's general elections. So it was just announced earlier today that Singapore will go to the polls on Friday, July 10th. So coming up on the show in about 10 minutes or so, we're going to be speaking to political commentators about what they're expecting in these next 2.5 weeks. But first, some Malaysian politics for you. In an interview with Sinchu Daily, Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad said that he will pull out of the Pakatan Harapan Plus coalition after PKR declined to name him as its Prime Minister candidate. But Mahathir said he would continue to work with DAP and Amanah since the two parties are supporting him for the top post. We also have Warisan and the sacked Bersatu MPs who are also endorsing Mahathir as their PM pick. However, in a separate interview, Anwar Ibrahim told Channel News Asia that at best he was willing to consider a role for Dr. Mahathir similar to that of a senior minister or a minister mentor, kind of like the role Lee Kuan Yew took on when he retired in Singapore.
Yeah, fascinating, this ongoing problem within what is the federal opposition, once of course the government of the day. Now it looks like, Melissa, we have an impasse, right? The two men, seeming not to want to give way to either.
Yep.
So the question is whether Dr. Mahathir can achieve his goal of being Prime Minister again without the help of Anwar Ibrahim and PKR, and whether Anwar Ibrahim and PKR can achieve, the recovery of the people's mandate, as they call it, without, in fact, joining hands with Dr. Mahathir.
So do you reckon that this kind of inability of the federal opposition to put up a united front is just down to the personality, these two personalities, the contesting personalities of these two men?
Yeah, that's very interesting because, one is tempted to say that, okay, maybe this is, a throwback to an earlier time and to the late 90s.
Yes, deja vu.
Yes, deja vu, and of course it's a Groundhog Day for some, meaning that we are forced into this endless cycle of repetition with these two individuals. Melissa, I'm most concerned about young people as they watch this. They had and they were lucky enough to witness a real breakthrough in terms of power shifts in the country, new conversations, a new hope. We had that tagline, Malaysia Baru, with all the problems that it was there as well. I mean, there was the rhetoric and there was the reality, but there was still hope of change, especially for them and their futures. The question is, the optics of this current struggle between Anwar Ibrahim and Dr. Mahathir, how are they viewing it? Yeah,
the young people, right? I'm hearing a lot of chatter about frustration, discontent among young people that the political fate of the country is being decided by a much, much older generation who may not have, a stake in the future of the country as much as they do. But let's move on to other news, Sharaad. We have the former Human Resource Minister, M. Kulasegaran. He's weighed in on the issue of foreign workers in the country. He revealed today that the previous Pakatan Harapan cabinet had received some 40 recommendations on foreign worker management since February of last year. However, none of those recommendations were implemented by the Home Ministry, then headed by Tan Sri Muhyiddin Yassin. According to Kula, the issues around migrant workers could have been addressed if the then Home Minister had been firm, transparent and corruption-free in its management of foreign labour. That's the entire ministry, according to Kulasegaran. In a statement, he said, to quote him, the Home Ministry has a long history of managing foreign workers that has led to entrenched interests that would not readily give up its privileges. What more if it involves lucrative deals or doing away with relationships cultivated over the years, end quote.
Fascinating stuff. And we wish politicians, currently in power and those who, have just held power, now longer in power, would reveal more vested interests. We've always known, I think, Melissa, that vested interests play a part in the way policy either changes or doesn't change. Vested interests, because refers to the fact that the foreign worker system, including those who are undocumented, really a part of an ecosystem. There are many people who profit from it. The question is, of course, how do you change a corrupt system? How do you remove those stakeholders who are obviously powerful? And maybe the first thing we need to do is actually find out what the analysis is.
Yes.
You know, and Melisa, I don't know if you remember the time in which the Council of Eminent Persons also had a report about the state of the nation, which you never heard from.
Also, the ERC, the Electoral Reform Committee, they put out an interim report that I think went to the then Prime Minister, but that was not made public. How were we then, at that point in time, going to have a conversation about electoral reform if we did not know what the proposals were? Very much the same in this case. I think it's fascinating, though, coming back to the issue of of these recommendations, what that means. So when a government puts together a committee or a council or a kind of panel to look into a certain issue and then give recommendations to the government, but then those recommendations are not acted on or not made public for the for the public to hold them to account, where do those recommendations go? Where do those committee reports go? I think that we have to pay attention to those types of panels and committees.
Because the media could always go to the individuals who are involved, unless they've signed a non-declaration form or
an official secret act.
Something like that. Yes, because former Court of Appeals Judge Hishamuddin Yunus was the person who helped form the committee in 2018, and then Chief Secretary of the government was charged with implementing that. So how do you take those recommendations in operational terms, and how do you turn that into something that can actually be put into practice? And all those people will know, they know exactly what went wrong. The question is, are we going to hear those stories at some point in time?
Okay, well, we're going to take a quick break on the show, but after this, we'll turn our attention across the causeway, take a closer look at what to expect as Singapore heads to the polls. Stay tuned to consider this. Hi, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. Today, Singapore announced that general elections will be held on July the 10th, with incumbent Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong seeking a fresh mandate to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, nomination day will be a week from today, which means there will be about 9 days of campaigning. What can we expect during this period? Joining us on the line to discuss this further, we have Elvin Ong, postdoctoral research fellow at the Centre for Southeast Asia Research at the University of British Columbia in Canada. Elvin, thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. You're joining us from Singapore. The government there only is required to call an election by April of next year, if I'm not mistaken. So did the announcement, Elvin, to hold polls now during a public health crisis come as a surprise to you?
Overall, I don't think the elections come as a surprise. Singaporeans have been anticipating an election for a couple of months now, until the COVID-19 pandemic blew up in Singapore in the first half of this year. So overall, now that the situation has stabilized, after about 3 months, we had 2 months of a circuit breaker lockdown period. The situation has stabilized somewhat. The COVID-19 transmission in the community has reduced down to single digits every day. And although there is still quite a significant amount of COVID-19 transmission in the migrant worker dormitories, there is not so much transmission within the community. So I think the government is now taking the opportunity to say, okay, things have stabilized now, and we can try to have a fresh mandate to try to put in a new team to try to bring Singapore forward into a post-COVID-19 future.
Elvin, are you surprised that that Lee Hsien Loong, who heads the PAP, the party that's been in power since independence, that he would frame this particular campaign around the COVID-19 pandemic? Was it a kind of obvious choice in terms of rhetoric?
I think it is a fairly obvious choice because many Singaporeans have been affected by the pandemic situation. Many Singaporeans have lost jobs. Many Singaporeans have contracted COVID-19 themselves and or have loved ones who have contracted COVID-19 and find themselves in the hospital. So what Lee Hsien Loong now is trying to do is to say, look, the entire COVID response has been helmed by the new fourth generation leadership in Singapore, and you have seen how they have performed over the past few months in trying to stabilize the situation, in trying to put forth 4 budgets to try to revive the economy and help people keep their jobs. And so Lee Hsien Loong is now trying to have this opportunity to say, look, you have seen how the new 4G leadership has done, and now it's your time to put your trust in them to bring you forward into the future.
So, Elvin, what do you reckon are some of the top concerns that Singaporean voters are thinking about as they head into towards polling day?
I think really primarily the main concern some people have been telling us is that the main focus will be on this new 4G leadership. So as many of you know, the new 4G leadership in Singapore is being fronted by the current Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Heng Swee Keat, and he also has a team working behind him, such as the Minister Lawrence Wong, who is the head of the multi-ministry task force battling COVID-19. So I think many people are approaching these elections, seeing these elections as a referendum on the 4G leadership.
Okay, that's quite interesting. If I could just interrupt you, Elvin, sure. I wanted to ask you, for those of us watching from the outside observers to Singaporean politics, has anything changed in the last 5 years? Since Singapore went to elections in 2015, has the political landscape of Singapore changed?
The political landscape of Singapore has changed somewhat, I would say. At 2015, we had the Workers' Party, the main opposition party, winning only a handful of seats in the parliament. But since then, what we have seen is a new opposition party come up, and that is the Progress Singapore Party. So this Progress Singapore Party, the new opposition party, is being fronted by Mr. Tan Cheng Bock. And Mr. Tan Cheng Bock, he was formerly Central Executive Committee member of the PAP, and he was a PAP Member of Parliament for 6 terms. And he was also a presidential candidate in 2011, but unfortunately he lost in the presidential elections in 2011 by a razor-thin margin. And so, approaching these elections, yes, he has formed this new Progress Singapore Party to try to contest in the next general elections. And from the media reports, he is putting up quite a few number of candidates throughout the western part of Singapore. So that is definitely something to look out for.
Elvin, what about the kind of very public family feud in the Lee family? And because Lee Hsien Loong, brother of Lee Hsien Loong, known to have shown himself publicly supporting Tan Cheng Bock. I mean, the dynamics matter at all at this point in time in the midst of a pandemic? Do people care about that Lee feud?
I think there are definitely significant segments of Singaporeans who do care about this Lee family feud, so to speak. But I would say by and large, the vast majority of Singaporeans, even though they may know a few intrigues of the entire feud, they mostly see this as a private family matter. And to actually bring it out into an open, to publicly challenge the Prime Minister, I would say the majority of Singaporeans don't think that is a very, I would say, simply put, nice thing to do, right? So for those who care about it, they've already cared about it, and they're going to factor that into their voting calculations. But I would say the vast majority of Singaporeans I wouldn't take that much into consideration.
Okay. Well, Elvin, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. Really appreciate your time and your insights. Now, we're going to take a quick break, but we'll continue our discussion on Singapore in just a few minutes. So stay tuned to consider this. Thank you for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation about Singapore heading to the polls this July 10th. Joining us on the line now, we have journalist Kirsten Han. Kirsten is the founder of regional online publication New Naratif. She's also the curator of We the Citizens. Kirsten, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said that he was seeking a fresh mandate to deal with the pandemic. Is the ruling government's response to the public health crisis so far considered an asset going into campaigning or a liability, in your opinion?
I think it would depend on what you care about, because if you are somebody who is really concerned about the treatment of migrant workers, none of whom are actually voters, then you would see the COVID response as less wanting. I think if you were focused on, if you followed the narrative that they had, that these are two separate infections, one happening in the dorm and one much better among the community, then you might think about it as, oh, they're doing the best they can. We wouldn't have expected it to get so bad and judge them more kindly. So I think it really kind of depends on what people's priorities are in that way.
Kirsten, I want to focus, if we can, on the opposition parties and the narrative that they are kind of developing in order to mount a campaign. Is it going to be specific to the management of the COVID pandemic, or is it going to be the older narrative of the need for democratic representation, and have they got a strategy that says, well, actually the PAP is going to remain in power even on nomination day, so don't worry, you'll still have the PAP, but you can have your democratic opposition as well. What exactly is their strategy going into this campaign?
I think it's very much, they will continue to talk about needing more voices in Parliament, more diversity in Parliament, but I think because COVID will be so much on people's minds that it will inadvertently, no matter what, keep coming up over and over again, and not just specifically COVID, but what people are worried about post-COVID, like the job losses, the economic recession. And so there'll be a lot of discussion probably about how, if we had more perspectives, maybe we could have handled COVID better, but also talking about the bread and butter issues as Singapore tries to adjust towards this post-pandemic world.
Okay. So your sense of the top issues that will feature prominently during the campaign period would be not just the public health response to COVID-19, but also the economic fallout from the pandemic. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. I think that's something that people are very worried about.
Okay.
Kirsten, what about the small toehold that the opposition has in Singapore in the form of a GRC, the group it's a cluster of MPs, if you like, to kind of translate that for a Malaysian audience. Will they be able to hold on to it? They've had to manage town councils and such. Have they been performing? What do you think of the issues for them to hold on to this little slither, slither of Singapore going into this campaign?
I think it will be quite a tough fight, particularly because the opposition parties can't leverage on the things that they used to be able to do as much as possible during the elections. For example, the physical rallies. So the Workers' Party, which is the party that has this group, 6-member group constituency, was able to attract huge crowds during their rallies. We're talking like 20,000 people, which is really quite special for Singapore. And this year they can't do that, so they can only rely on online channels, some live streaming, and some limited airtime on TV, and so I think it will be, quite difficult for them to have a campaign that's as robust as previous elections might have been. But
so, Kirsten,
think,
do you think that could do you think that could level the playing field? Those safe distancing measures that limit physical campaigning, would that perhaps be in the? I guess would that benefit smaller parties, or do you see that as a disadvantage?
I think it's a disadvantage. So for physical walkabouts, they can still do that as long as the actual gathering is fewer than 5 people. But I think moving the bulk of the election campaigning online does disadvantage smaller parties in a way, because any of us who use social media realize that it's not a great equalizer, that it is a sort of arms race as to who can game the algorithm better, who can afford the best digital marketing team, who has the best sort of ability to promote content or generate content that is the most search engine optimized and all that. And I think that could be quite difficult if you are a new party, and some of the parties going into the elections this time are new parties, and you're still trying to build up the number of Facebook likes that you have and build up the engagement that you have. You're actually fighting against the algorithm to try to get your content out there, particularly if you don't have a big budget to promote and do sponsored posts and things like that.
Kirsten, we see around the world, crises don't necessarily promote a sense of adventure or experimentation in politics. People go back to the tried and tested.
Risk averse.
They might become increasingly risk averse. Do you see that in Singapore as well? I mean, could the little representation that the opposition parties have in Parliament be completely wiped off because Singaporeans want to make sure that the tried and tested PAP is dominant in government?
Yes, I think so. I think, Singaporeans are, even before COVID, already quite risk averse. So that is a big possibility that this flight to safety mentality will be an issue in this elections, particularly because the PAP is, playing this up, right? Like that this is unprecedented times, this is a pandemic, and not just a pandemic, but there are all these other things happening around the world, like trade war and everything. And this is an uncertain thing, and that's why we need a strong government that's united with the people to take us forward. And so I think this narrative does kind of encourage people to want to play it safe. But there is a segment also who does think that it's very important to have diversity. So it's kind of, people are going to be trying to figure out how to balance that, because people want more opposition in Parliament for accountability, but they don't want to accidentally topple the PAP government. So it's always this sort of game of trying to avoid what they call a freak election.
Kirsten, just very quickly, what do you rate Tan Cheng Bock and his Singapore Progress Party's chances at the polls?
I think there are Singaporeans who find it very appealing, because he does have the legitimacy of having been a former PAP MP. And so, it's hard to kind of just write him off as, he's just an opposition rabble-rouser, because he has this very respectable pedigree of having been such a long-serving MP behind him. So it does appeal to Singaporeans who do want to see more opposition voices in Parliament to hold the PAP accountable. But I'm also afraid that, maybe a lot of the opposition are just opposing for the sake of opposing. They're going to cause gridlock, because, again, that's the mindset that's been kind of cultivated in Singapore, right? Like, too much opposition causes gridlock. So someone like Tan Cheng Bock is like this middle ground of, he's going to give us more transparency and accountability, but he's not so threatening and so radical that it's going to bring things to a halt.
All right, Kirsten, thank you so much for speaking with us. We hope to check in with you throughout this campaign period and perhaps closer to the polls, but we appreciate your time tonight. That's all the time we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching. Good night.